tell you what new materials are, but we want to sort of tell you how they've been productive for us, and get you to think critically about using them or engaging with them critically, and like any theoretical framework, sort of make it your own as we go through it. And so we're really interested here in sort of having a cross-pollination of ideas, and showing you maybe just, even if we could just provoke something in all of us here together today, that would be something we would want to do. And I think it's just in the spirit of making these theory method seminars also have a discussing format for them as well as a presentation format. So.
No, I think just sort of keep in mind that these are imminent or emerging ideas, and so if there are things that you hear that you think, because we're also looking for other ways to work together, and so we're trying to figure out, we don't know, we're in discussions and things like that, but if there are things as you hear something that you think, well, maybe at the end or in the midst of it, you have to wait till the end, but you have an idea or something pops into your head, please feel free to just join in or ask a question or interrupt, for that we just find with us.
So new materialism it's a constellation of theories and methodologies that it's fairly recent. To characterize it would be pretty difficult because there's a lot of disagreement about what it entails and who is relevant, who's not relevant. But what we mean by new materialism, the way that we use it, is sort of a turn to the material and a turn to ontology along with language, discourse, and epistemology. So critical theory and especially the post-structural schools have adhered largely to concepts such as discourse, epistemology, and also the human. And so new materialism sort of breaks these boundaries down by dealing with materiality and ontology as critical concepts by which you can engage the world, essentially. And so some of the work that we draw from in our work as Karen Barad, Liz Guattari, Manuel DeLanda, Rosie Berdotti. So there's different schools, and we should say this too, is that Michelle and I don't necessarily agree on everything.
No, we don't.
But we have, there's a lot we do agree on.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that.
Okay. And so what we want to clarify is when we say that new materialism is a response to the linguistic turn that privileges discourse and epistemology, it's not a response that says, no, that's not right. It is more like it is a way of saying that good work that has already been initiated, and new materialism and social ontologies remind us that the ontologies and the material cannot be separated and are equally significant. And the work that we sort of provide here, they're sampling, basically, of scholars currently working in these areas with these ideas. Ideas that are deeply felt and rooted in the work of Whitehead, Elizabeth Ellsworth, Elizabeth St. Pierre, Bruno Latour, and Graham Harman, people who essentially have paved the way for this work and the ideas that we're discussing today.
Yeah, so really what the question that's sort of at the back is, what do they make visible, what's visible and possible with new materialisms? I just want to, and attention to what comes out of dialogue as well. Do you want to read you want me to read it?
No, I think I can read it now that I'm a little bit closer. Before I was not close. So just as points of clarification, I guess, Rosie Berdotti describes new materialism as it dissolves boundaries between the natural and cultural, mind and matter, and reminds researchers that we cannot ignore the power of matter and the ways it materializes in our ordinary experiences. It fails to acknowledge the primacy of matter in our theories. The invitation of new materialism is to think about research in a way that moves beyond conceptualizing that privileges language to a consideration of the non-human. And I guess one of the biggest things is, how do we care for the histories of others, as people like Deborah Britzman and others suggested, who offer a shift from self and other, in that self is other and other is self. And later we'll relate this to the idea of entanglement as a way to emphasize our meaning of the term.
So, so again, one of the ways we come together, just to kind of summarize so far, Michelle and I both connect over this idea that ontology is a critical point of engagement for critical work in education. And one of the things we're trying to do is take theory and method and sort of, this is sort of, regardless of new materialisms or socio-materialisms, we're trying to sort of bend it back on what we've thought before. And I think this is, coming here, being a new professor here, this is something that I'm hoping that continues in our grad program, to be able to kind of think differently. And we both are interested in this idea of being responsible in the world. New materialism brings forward new ideas for ethics and responsibility. So if we, in a nutshell, if we see ourselves as being hopelessly entangled, then it says something different about ethics than what has traditionally been understood by that term. And also, I should say that Michelle and I, as well with a lot of you here, are really following a big trend in theory and education. It's not like we've decided that, hey, this is a really good idea, let's tell it to the, like, this is something that's happening at schools everywhere right now. So it's not like, and a lot of the questions are like, what's new about new materialism? But anyway, and which actually is I think an important point to bring up, because materiality has been something that has always been integral to thought in some way. So for example, indigenous thought and philosophy has always privileged the material. And I would even say that in a way, old materialists or Marxists have also have their way of engaging the material too, in ways that are actually somewhat a little similar with new materialism. So that's just to throw that out
And
there.
in the previous kinds of material, the world was identified by human sense data. The senses were considered separate, where in analysis things are separated out and strung together to come to a conclusion of what something is. Through the ideas that we're thinking about and we now know, the senses do not work in isolation. They work through bodily sensations and also sense things that are not directly there.
So we wanted to talk today, give an overview of 5 concepts that we think have been very useful for our work. So the assemblage, agential realism, the commons, diffraction, and interaction or interaction. And again, we want to just kind of quickly talk about how they've been productive. And for me, I'll start with assemblage. So the assemblage is something I get from Toulouse-Guattari's work. And really, it's a very basic term, but really what it really means is an assembly of material and discursive entities. So if you think about it, it's a turn to an ontological frame where you have the material and the discursive sort of mixing together. And it's a way that you can engage social phenomena and physical phenomena that way. So it's a creative, theoretical, and methodological approach. So anything like texts, classrooms, ecosystems are all assemblages of parts that have capacities and relations of exteriority, and they fit together in ways that are both virtual and actual, and can't necessarily be predicted beforehand. So the whole idea around the assemblage is sort of getting at ways to imagine, and I have done this with my students, ways to imagine different actions and different ways of being within a material discursive entanglement. And so I just want to give you a couple of examples. And the way I do it in my work has been through diagramming, using simple diagrams. The diagrams are interesting because they're both ontological spaces, but they're also discursive. So they're not quite one or the other, they're kind of a mix of things. And the diagrams I do are meant to provoke. They're not meant to be great works of art. In fact, I had this joke that they're kind of stupid in some ways. But if the diagram doesn't provoke you, it fails. And one thing I should say about assemblages too is that quite literally there are things, the way to think about them is tetravalent, they can be. But just in a nutshell, what that means is they're both material and discursive, but they can also be really bound up and tightened, or territorialized and overcoded, or they can be sort of free-flowing and loose and deterritorialized. So they can be sort of governed in different ways. And that's, I think, useful for just approaching assemblages in general. You're either getting something really tight and territorialized and tight together, or you're getting something deterritorialized. They often privilege like critical theorists often privilege deterritorialization, and rhizomatic being the rhizome, and this is again going to Toulouse, but I think that Toulouse and Guattari are a little bit more ambivalent about what is better and what is good. They both exist in the world, is the point. So I use the metaphor, and this is one of the papers that I did in philosophy and theory. You can think of it as having dials. You can dial up the assemblage and tighten it, or you can dial it down and loosen it. You can overcoat it, or have it be free-flowing. That's sort of just a general overview. And this is just an ontological approach I use to characterize the field of science education, sort of the big dominant department of education in the United States, PISA, sort of overcoding or dominating free rhizomatic forms of thought that sometimes are not allowed to come forth. I also use them. This is a chapter I did about queering nature and having a queer relationship with queer nature. So it's a fictional camping trip that we took to Camp Wild. And to map out that, we sort of used assemblages as a way to relate the material components of our location. This is all virtual, of course. The material components of our trip with things like discourse, categorization, identity, and the assemblage mapping it out allowed us to kind of see some of these relations. So it's a way to see and imagine possibilities. So that's how I've used assemblage. So, but again, the key point is that it's a turn to this ontological, the ontological element of our work, not just the discursive, not just the philosophical. So that's assemblages. What about indentual realism?
Yeah, and so the other thing I forgot to say at the very beginning is that as my dissertation draft has gone to my committee, my full committee, so I want to use these kinds of opportunities as a way to prepare for the inevitable defense, whatever that might be. So also keep that in mind. If you have some suggestions about how I might articulate things better, please don't hesitate. And I'm also, not because of my uncertainty so much anymore, but because I think one of the things I'm learning is that the more that you know, the less you know, and the more humility you probably need to show. So sometimes when I read directly from it's not that I'm interested in looking at you, it's that I'm just trying to keep myself in order. So anyway, because one of the most significant parts of my doctoral study were taken up in relation to the constitution of the self and subsequent subjectivity, I found myself searching for something that opened up both capacity of what a self might become and what more a self might be. Where subjectivity could be sensed not as a defined imposition, where the self or subject could be conceptualized as something always in division instead, always in process of giving itself away to the next moment and to the next step. And it was here that I found Karen Barad's notion of agential realism very helpful. Key to her work with agential realism is the distinction she makes between the terms interaction and interaction. In interaction, before any encounter with other, each self is predetermined, preformed, fixed, and where the self and accompanying subjectivities emerge happens in the midst of, as opposed to interaction, where the self and subjectivities emerge from within the relations or the meaning of subjects or selves.
Yeah.
And so also sort of following her line of thinking, this idea of diffraction. Now the notion of diffraction has been something that that was really hard for me to sort of grapple with and understand my work. And while I feel certain of what I might call a good enough understanding and but a full and robust definition of what it means would exceed the point of this seminar and the time. So what I suggest instead as a way of understanding diffraction is to offer some ideas about how the often used and wonderful, I'd say, attempts found within methods of reflection, reflexivity, and even refraction differ from the notion of diffraction. So where reflection and reflexivity are inclined towards articulating the unexplored meanings or hidden meanings that are inherent in practice and the self, this thinking facilitates the search for new meaning through digging deeper into what people already do and how they can improve and match a better representation of themselves. Diffraction instead is more attuned to differences, more interested in bringing out the fundamental divergence of practices over time. Diffraction is thus attuned to widening possibilities rather than articulating meaning, as I think are found in both reflection and reflexivity. So I just wanted to say one thing, and so then the searching came then down to the methods. And I found one method in particular which was called Interview to the Double, and it's a method that was created by David Nicolini and Birgit Rowe, and they did some work with midwives, and so they wanted to understand capture practice. So what they did was they just basically asked one essential question, but premised the question by saying that tomorrow I'm going to come in and I will be you, hypothetically, of course. So I want you to describe your practice as intricately as you can, so that when I come in, hypothetically, the students in your midwifery classes won't notice it's not you. And so what happens in the ITT is it multiplies what a practice and subject might be, rather than trying to reveal its inner core. In this sense, diffraction moves from identifying what was present and contained within interaction to analyzing interactions. So one of the things that I did with the participants, and one in particular was this was a person who had in her life done some things that she wasn't proud of. And through the interview to the double, she was a cooperating teacher that worked with me, and she described her practice with interns and with her students. And she basically discovered through this process of ITD, that she was keeping herself in a particular sense of herself and couldn't get outside of it. And what she noticed in doing the interview to the double was the ways in which that she treated others were in fact some practices that she could turn on herself and wonder, what if I treated my students, myself, with the same care and the same thoughtfulness and the same hope for something better, for something different. And she came to this realization, and many of them came to some realization of what more there might be. And so, briefly, that was sort of my move. We don't have to.
So the last one is the commons. So now, being an environmental educator, but also like someone who's interested in political theory, the commons is a concept, and I use my understanding of the commons comes really from Hart and Negri. And so the commons it's a political concept and it's a philosophical concept, but it's also, and so this is where new materialism and socio-materialism has helped, it's also an ontological concept. So, so by the commons, what I really mean is everything we share in common. So lakes, rivers, language, ideas. And the commons, whether we're talking about an ecosystem or a library, is sort of made by the interaction of multiplicity. So it's made by the interaction of differences. And through that interaction, the commons grows and then becomes a place where more interaction can happen. So it's simultaneously the base and the ends by which things in the world function. At least that's one way to look at it. So in education, I think the goal of education should be to nurture the commons, so provide the grounds for interactions of multiplicities, but also prevent the commons from being enclosed, or and to get really political about it, prevent it from being privatized. So my view of ontologies, and why I love the term ontologies, is that I don't think ontologies aren't things you can privatize. Being doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to everybody, has access to being. So in a way, the turn to ontology and socio-materialism has helped me develop further my understanding of what the commons can be. And so relating the assemblage of commons in the commons together, I've often put different elements together in my papers to see how they might interact side by side. So this is an assemblage of the idea of the metropolis and the idea of big pharma agro coming together, and this is an assemblage of the enclosure of the commons in terms of the Alberta tar sands. So different forces. So assemblages can also be forces of desire, forces of creation. It doesn't necessarily have to be something overcoated by language or signs and the materials. So there's lots of different things going on there. So that's kind of an overview of those concepts. Should I just, yeah?
Maybe before, I don't know if any of this makes sense, or me, Jeffrey always makes sense. If you have any questions before, because we're going to have an activity. If you have any questions, and if you don't, that's okay too.
I mean, and also maybe I'll just say these are the questions we were going to,
yes.
Yeah, like they're just backdrop questions, but like, so the questions that we want to kind of pose here is like, are problems in education simply a matter of policy, curriculum, classroom practice, and institutions, or can they be much more intricate and complex? And how are entities such as plants, animals, subjects, non-humans, hopelessly entangled? And I think this is a big question. I think this idea of different forms of entanglement, which is really important, is if we're entangled in much more intricate ways than we thought, what does it mean for ethical responsibility? And how does that ethical responsibility change? And that's one of the points that we're really connected on in talking about. So, yeah, so now, yeah, I mean, why don't we...
So I'd like you to go back to the first slide, the second slide that has all the different levels of different ontological concepts. And I just, because you did go very quickly through that, I just need to digest what you've said in terms of how these five, these are what you believe, these are both your...
They're not, well, there are some are, so I work with the assemblage of the commons. I like Karen Barad. I use Karen Barad, but I'm not a Baradian. Like I don't use diffraction that much, and I use interaction. So there's sort of they're a combination of both of ours. That's what I'm trying to say.
So while we sense overlapping, it's true. I mean, that's part of what's happening, is we're trying to figure a way, and we're using in some ways you all as a kind of conduit of some sort to help us see where we rub up against in ways that we won't resolve. And then perhaps there are ways in which we can resolve some things and look more deeply with the ideas. So if there are clarifications of the ones that each of us sort of talked about, we're happy to do that to the best of our ability.
One of the unifying things with these is a more intricate turn towards the ontological. So thinking about being and matter and materiality in ways that are creative. One of the things that I was talking to Elaine about this morning, is that I sort of think, I see in new materialisms, and I'm not saying that this happens all the time, but like I think there needs to be interpretation with theory too. So like, just because Karen Brad says something doesn't mean that this is ontological reality. That's what scientists do. They tell you that's what they historically have done, right? So I think that what it requires is like we're all academics, so it requires us to like play with these theories and see what we like, have a reading of Barad that's your own, that works.
But just to add one quick thing. The thing that sort of the site of my research was the field experience. So I was interested in the relationships between the interns and their supervisors beyond what, I don't have a better word at the moment, the paradigmatic understanding. So often you'll hear people in the field saying, well, this intern I had before was so great, or when I was an intern. So it's always holding up a model of perfection. And through my own internship experience, that wasn't the case. I wasn't ideal. I wasn't a model. I came with a life of great experience and mistakes or whatever. And so I was really being asked to leave that aside, and I found that problematic. And that there was only one sense of self that I could carry forward in this situation. And so I wondered about that in relation to others. So with having other opportunities here in Regina, at the University of Regina, working alongside interns and pre-interns, I saw some of these things being replicated. And so I began to wonder, is that all the self can be? What more might there be? And so that's why agential realism was helpful to me, because and I wouldn't say I think Barad knows everything, but what she did was she took from the field of physics, quantum physics, and she offered an invitation to the humanities. And it's not just occurring in science. There is, when we talk about boundaries to break down, what about if we recognize that they're not boundaries so much as entanglements that we can attune to? So with this in mind, I thought, what if I don't know in advance what a teacher intern should be, or the supervising teacher ought to be in advance of their interaction, what might happen? And so that's where that term became helpful to me, that the subject emerges as a result of noticing the entanglements, and also the ways in which they're affected by the measurement, or the apparatus, or the methods. How the method becomes part of the outcome. So what we choose, the ethics for me then became what we choose to measure with, how tightly we decide to measure or release, and that idea that you had about the turning up or letting go. How can our measurements become more ethical? So it will change then what are we looking for?
I had a question on one. Can you go back to the first question, or the list of questions there? I'm just thinking, from my background with inclusive education.
This one?
Yeah, this one here, thanks. So our problems in education simply a matter of policy, curriculum, and institutions. And I think about how in inclusive education, sometimes we struggle with, oftentimes we struggle with supporting individuals with exceptional learning needs. But inclusive education, actually, as Dr. Cranston said yesterday in his presentation, it's so much more than just exceptionalities. It's supporting individuals that come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And this is even political a bit too, to say, like, how can you represent individuals that you don't have a shared experience with? And maybe this touches on the commons a little bit. I don't have a very good understanding of that, but I wonder, like, if you as a teacher have students in your class that come from a background that you don't have a common appreciation for, or not appreciation, understanding of disability that you don't have a common understanding of, then whether you want to or not, you simply may not have the knowledge to design policy, to write curriculum, and to put together an institution to best support them in the general classroom or other types of classrooms. I know, Jesse, you with your boys, maybe you think about this a little bit too, but like, is the lack of focus on developing interests for your boys? I know you talked about how that's a big debate for you and your wife, or the important debate to be having. Is that because of a lack of understanding of their position and who they are and what's best for special education?
I mean, definitely, and I think from what you're saying, and I think what matches up to what we're saying is that this idea of entanglement, so it's not just about the distribution of services and I'll go with one of your ideas, understanding the other necessarily,
Okay.
although it involves those things, but maybe the ethics of this is about understanding entanglement, understanding disability as entanglement. So looking at, so the way it would match up, I think, with what we're saying is, and with this idea of the assemblage, which is big with me, is trying to trace the entanglement of disability in students would be an ontological question you could ask, like, how do we ethically meet the needs of these students when we don't know what it's like.
Right.
But at the same time, what this set of theories is telling us is that even if you think that you're separate from this, you're hopelessly entangled. So tracing after the ways that disability is entangled here with all of us would be a way that you could then break down the boundaries in terms of what kind of education we think certain people should have, but also like how someone who's had different experiences can follow the entanglement and come out to new educational practices. So I think it would be, I always see this problem of a question of mapping. We map these different maps of these entanglements. Like how am I, even though I'm able-bodied, how am I entangled in oppressions? And that's one thing to do, but also what are the material entanglements of this question?
So is it like, when you talk about entanglement, is it recognizing that as a neurotypical individual, I am still affected by?
Yes, and going further, you are co-extensive with it. The very fact that you're this collection of matter in this assemblage is because of these things emerging together.
Okay.
And so you're hopelessly attached to it. So your ethical responsibility is like the very thing that gives you able-bodiedness or some kind of normative stance is this entanglement. So you have a responsibility
okay.
to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I want to do, sorry, and I did this by going off on, as I often do, and students accuse me of, the TMAT was sort of, I took it all away, so I'm sorry. Can we go back to you were asking about the context? I'm
Right,
sorry.
so I have very limited understanding of new materialism, and that's why I drove like mad to get here. And for me, it's my relationship with the material world and how that affords me different ways of doing ontology and being. So that's my understanding. And I came to this understanding through Michelle, actually, maybe 2-3 years ago, when you were trying to use the tennis idea with the pre-interns and the interns
Right.
for your PhD study. And so that's how I got initially my understanding. And for me, it's a very decolonizing way of looking at the world in terms of how we've colonized land, earth, space, whatever. And now it's we're saying let's start looking closer at our relationship. So that's really what I know. I haven't read Barad. I haven't read any of the books that you've suggested. But to me, when you talk about entanglements, how is that different? How is this different from tensions? How is this different from bringing my own prior knowledge, world knowledges, into a situation which then becomes, and how I interpret the situation or what's happening there. So I'm thinking, is this just new verbiage entanglement for tensions, or is it, are you talking about prior knowledges, world knowledges, so forth and so on that we're bringing to the table? Or, so I actually think that what you're doing today is fabulous, but I wish you would go slower and sort of walk us through those 5 or 6 ontological concepts so that we get a clear understanding of where I think I get what you're saying, but I'm not 100% sure.
I wonder if I could just say about the tension,
Sure.
and again, this is just an attempt. The tension, I think, when we talk about we only need the tensions, neat because it keeps us ethical. If we don't acquiesce to one or the other. But it seems to me that the tensions continue to be discrete. I have a tension here, it comes into play with the tension here, and you can feel the force of the tension. In entanglement, as I is, you know, but not to stay fixed there. So she talks about an agential cut, where at some point we begin to notice. So we can, for that moment, call it something. But if we stay in that something too long, then we fix it in a category. And the categorical thinking, in fact, becomes problematic from her view. And I think it's beginning to be mine too. So,
Yeah.
Can we say like tension is more like a human construct, and the entanglement is more like get closer to a reality, what we are perceiving or we are perceiving.
yeah, I think that would be a better way to describe it. I just,
I wonder if addressing the commons might be a way of coming to this. It's one that you talk about a lot, Jesse, and I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't know much about. But the idea of what we share in common leaves something fixed, doesn't it, in some way? So the commons, if they were made by multiplicities, there would be this commons, this commons, this commons, this commons. I'm just looking at, taking from the language there. And I'm wondering if we're thinking in materialism and then in relation to the commons, if the commons, the only commons that I can see is we all have a capacity to differ. We're all on the same side of our capacity to differ. And that's common, but I don't know really anything else that we have in common.
Like it's an elusive concept. I think that that's kind of why it needs to be pursued. Like because we can't imagine we can imagine a social space where we're all a space of equality. We can imagine it. So we can imagine a commons national park. Like we can imagine commons. We can imagine free knowledge. And we can, so it's like, but I think I agree with you. Like, I don't think that you can, as I say, look, this is ontologically, this is the commons. I think, for me, the commons is more of virtual, it's a virtual concept, and it may be as multiplicitous as the multiplicities that make it up. It's true.
But what is common something that is what I bring, what my lens dictates, what I see in that
Yes.
nature or ecosystem or whatever. It might not be the same as Val, or it might not be the same as you, or any, you know. So now we're looking at theories around differences and similarities, and the intercultural spaces,
Definitely.
or inter or third space or liminal spaces, or
Yes.
the in-between spaces. And if you're saying that these in-between spaces are all entanglements, are they entanglements, or are they? I cannot see my identity without looking at Val. I mean, I see through her eyes who I am, right? I mean, that's how identity is. We self-identify through the other. And so it's the same thing with ecosystems and with land and with, is that not, am I in
No,
the
it's-
wrong space?
No, you're
Not at
not.
all.
No,
No, we're just
wrong space.
sorting, I
This is
think.
not. This is not easy stuff. There isn't
Yeah.
one way to say. In no way is it suggesting that what you're theorizing is not the right thing. It's just saying here's an alternate way that seems to also offer something, and not even necessarily beyond. It's just something that isn't that, which is not a judgment. It's more of a, well, what about this? And I think
I need to embrace this, but I can't embrace, I need to embrace this because I'm working on decolonizing pedagogies.
Of course.
And so if I'm not getting it all.
Well,
You know,
like,
and so I'm sort of getting a little bit nervous
No,
in
no.
the seat, because I'm thinking, I'm coming from a different lens, obviously. But it is,
Oh, but Sean has a question too.
Yeah, just finish though, because it's related, but not entirely.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the relationship between this process of diffraction which emphasizes difference
Indeterminacy more than difference.
Oh,
That's
okay.
what I'll say.
and entanglement. How
Yes.
does that highlight?
This is one of the things that was interesting. It took me a long time to figure it out. And what it came from were experiments with light. And so they would shoot light through a single slit, and they could sort of begin over time doing the same thing over and over, could predict the pattern that would appear on the wall on the other side. Then eventually they started experimenting with light, and they put two slits. And so what they noticed was on the other side there was more of a wave pattern on the other side. So they still got the similar patterns, but what they didn't know was which slit the light actually went through. So they did something called a which slit experiment, where they had a measurement device on the other side, or very close to where the slits, to determine which side it went through. So based on all the things that they'd done before, they determined if it went through one slit, one thing would happen in their mind, one thing would happen. And when they added this device of observation and measurement, what they found was that the electrons they shot through, when it was being measured, it actually began to interfere with itself and created on the end what looked like a wave pattern. So from this, it was Bohr and Heisenberg, these physicists got into a debate about what was actually happening, and it was Bohr who said that the measuring device actually affects the outcome, which I translated to actually affects the self. So that you can't just say, it is beyond, sometimes we say the reflexivity. We position ourselves as a researcher, and I know all the things I am, and I know the way it's going to affect the thing, and then we put it aside as we've done that confessional work. But this says, I always continue to be a part of what the self becomes on the other side. I can't separate myself out. And so diffraction actually showed that what we have to suspend what we know. They put the which split on the other side. Sometimes it went through in ways that were unpredictable, but also, but it was like I've seen it, in an example, how the electron actually falls back on itself, and then it becomes something they didn't predict. So it's not the uncertainty, but it was the indeterminacy of this measurement device that made me start thinking about how we measure anything, any matter, or any teaching practice, or any ism, or for me, I'm beginning to think this through. What other thing does it off?
Another thing I should add is that the ontological theory of entanglement from Barad and Deleuze-Guattari's assemblages are not necessarily perfectly. They don't have. It's not the same ontology. So, like when I think about assemblages from a Deleuzian point of view, I think about them as not as interactive. They're not theorized that way. They're theorized. The interaction is actually really important to the theory because that you have to account for the relations of exteriority in the assemblage. So that's just to say. All I mean to say is that the ontological theories we pull and use, they can vary. And then some of the other people we have there, Zelanda and Verdoti, they not only can the ontological theories vary, just like discourse theories can vary, but then the focus can vary. Like so some of my things that I sometimes get hung up on are the fact that my criticism with new materialism is, I'm very vocal about this, is that it doesn't have a political theory, and it may not, the way it's come, and that may be okay actually, because maybe the way that new materialism and what it responds to is precisely, it can have a political theory. Maybe that's the point. I don't really know yet, but my only point is that some of these theories they're not all hunky-dory with each other, and so those just that very idea of interaction, of co-emergence, becoming together of the interaction, and the idea of the assemblage as having two parts that fit together through relations of exteriority and have capacities, and then when they meet, they therefore then have new emergent capacities. That's a different ontological way to put materiality together. And so, my opinion is that just like critical theory or philosophy, we need to read it. We need to read it and make it productive, because it's probably wrong. Like just like all of these people are wrong, right? Like they're probably in some sense wrong. So
another place where we might disagree is that because I think Barad's work is about power, and power is always about politics. There's always maybe there's not a direct link, but we're never going to do this.
Yeah.
That we aren't always going to agree, and I think that she does talk about power relations, and when she does that in those ways, I think there is a relatability. I'm not exactly sure how yet, but there is potential there to understand politics.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would agree.
Do you think if, with this understanding of reality of what counts, what the knowledge, that'll open a space for more engagement, like more maybe intentional engagement with people, with groups that we don't tend to see the association or commonality with?
I think so, and I actually don't know how to say this, so I'll just skirt around the issue. Is that I think that these, like for example, in ECS 110, this idea of self and other, we talk about how the self is the other and the other is the self. So, I don't know. Do anybody know? Anybody like to offer something?
I-
How about you?
I'm still just trying to wrap my head around
Yeah.
it. I just think that
The
The self is other, not the
Self
other.
is other and other is self. I
Yeah.
see.
We
Okay,
always
that
have a
makes
part of
sense.
ourselves that we don't fully know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that there's that feeling of other, when we're engaged in things that, where we can have the opportunity to make decisions outside of, I think about this in relation to art. I think in art practice, we're always making decisions, so there's always a measurement or an assessment being made, but much of it is outside of conscious reflective awareness. A lot of it is just your body responding. You're making a line, you're making another line, you're responding sort of at the level of the body. And I think when we practice these kinds of, I call them creative practices, then maybe we are more sensitive to other interactions.
No, I just think of an example last night with my daughter in the bathroom getting ready for bed, and we just have some fruit fly in the bathroom, so I kind of trying to get rid of them or swap them sometimes. And she said, just don't swap. Why swap them? I said, like, it's kind of annoying. I said, oh, what do you do? She said, oh, I just said, like, don't get out. And then she told me something about mosquitoes. What she actually talked to them, say, bite me but don't let me itch. And that works. Like I just feel like how she sees other, right? Like the other, and then honoring what they need, but also trying not to be, bothered by that. Just fascinating how.
It is. How do we live with the differences that that are so distinct? As if we live with difference all the time. We live with difference every day, but we don't make a big issue of it. We live with it. But for those larger ones that are harder to just say we're going to live with them, what could this offer? And I think that's what your question is.
One of the things we didn't show was one of the articles that I did. So
Yeah.
looking at, so this is AIDS, HIV as a co-emergent phenomenon. So this is something I did in environmental education, but seeing how, so you talk about seeing possibilities in environmental education. So seeing how, the racialization of bodies, the political pushback from the multitude, safe spaces, disposable populations, pharmaceutical companies, capital, how it's all entangled. I think for me, my focus has been to try and, my terminology that I value is trying to do sort of a mapping and trying to think about these relations and forces. But it could be any forces of desire, forces of power. It could be all kinds of things. I think the idea that I like is so getting back to your example of, we talked about entanglement a little bit, it's freeing that in terms of thinking materially and ontologically. And it means there's one of the things we're going to have you do, I don't know if we're going to do it.
We should do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, just having you free up something. So we're going to have you make it. We're going to have you make an assemblage, but it doesn't have to be an assemblage. But we're going to do some diagramming, because yes, you don't have
Yes,
to.
you will, Fatima.
Yeah, but you don't have to be an assemblage. But basically, when you're doing a diagram, you're doing something that's both ontological. It's not discursive, right? Because it has a sort of a spatial materiality to it. It's like a feel. But you can write on it with discourse. So it's kind of both at the same
But
time.
visuals are discourse.
Yes. But they're also like, yes, but I mean, you could also argue that like, so then all of this room is discourse, as everything is discourse.
Absolutely,
Right.
because we read
Right.
everything that's
So where
around
is
us.
the material?
Everything around us